Hello, everyone, once again. This is Rob, and welcome back to Media Awareness and a book review slash compare and contrast between its Netflix um, counterpart. But before I get to that, a reminder the fundraiser continues. For those of you new to my channel or unaware, I am a disabled individual and I use a motorized wheelchair slash scooter all day, every day for my independence, and I need your help. My insurance will not cover anything with regard to my scooter as they view it as a quote luxury item end quote. Despite the fact that I am unable to walk whatsoever, in addition to being unable to use any other type of power chair or even a standard wheelchair for that matter, as I only have limited use of one hand. In addition to that, I do not have a backup scooter or wheelchair at the present time, so if my scooter does malfunction, as it recently did, I will yet again be a fish out of water, a scenario that I want to avoid at all costs. With that stated, I have a spot fund account linked below in two places. It's a fundraising account. It is directly below the title in the description, as well as in a separate section below the information pertaining to the video itself. Any and all support is welcome. Even $5 or $10 helps out and adds up over time. I'm endeavoring at the current time to both refurbish my existing scooter completely, as well as to have enough to purchase a new scooter. This scooter I'm using is from 2019, and it is now 2024 as I film this, so it is in need of replacement, but it's also in need of dire repairs. And unfortunately, as stated, the insurance does not cover any of that. So, any and all support, like I said, is welcome. I, as alluded to, was without power to my scooter for roughly a 2 week time frame in which I had to rely on family and friends to push me around my own home, severely limiting my independence as it stands. And although I'm not 100% independent, I do pride myself on the things I can do. And not being able to do those things really uh, affected me psychologically, and it also got me to realize how significant it is that I have a working scooter at all times. Hence, the uh, fundraiser being altered to some degree to not only refurbish my existing scooter to act as a backup in the event my scooter should fail, and the addition of having a new scooter so that way I'm never without a backup. Basically, if my new scooter malfunctions, once I have it, I can rely on the newly refurbished model and use that until I'm able to repair the new scooter. And I feel that it's a logical step, a really well thought out plan, and I really think it will benefit me in the long run in terms of my life and my lifestyle as a whole. I do want to extend a gracious thanks to those who have contributed thus far, in addition to those who plan on contributing to the Spot Fund account. Any and all support, as previously stated, is welcome, and I do appreciate you all. I love you all, and it really means the world to me. You can also contribute anonymously if you desire, so if you do, please do so. In addition to that, please consider subscribing to my channel and becoming part of the media awareness family. I'd love to have you. I cover music, movies, literature, um, and a plethora of media related topics. So, with all of that stated, I am really excited to bring you this book review. I was hoping to have my first book review on this channel be Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. However, I'm still reading that. It's a very long book. And I took a break from that briefly to read You by Caroline Kemp's. Um, and it was adapted obviously into the Netflix original series, which lasted for 4 seasons at the current time. I don't know whether or not there's going to be a season 5 or not, but that's neither here nor there. We're here to focus on the novel itself and um, the uh, changes made to the characters in the series and different characters that were added in the series and um, my thoughts on why they were added and why they potentially detract from the overall impact of the story that was told in the novel itself. But first, let's talk about the novel. Oh my God. If you have not read this book, you have to read this book. It is amazing. And I wish I would have known about the book and read it prior to watching the series. I really, really do. Um, However, in hindsight, in reading the book, I really uh, it's like a totally different experience in all actuality because uh, you really have a different main character in the character of Joe Goldberg, and I'll get to that momentarily. Um, the book itself uh, focuses on Joe Goldberg from his perspective as it's sort of told in the series as well. So we get that same continuity of the narrative being from Joe's perspective in his mind and how he sees, thinks of, and interprets different situations, which I think is a fascinating uh, storytelling method in this context, as it really sheds light on his actions and why he is so uh, obsessive, um, but also it really gives us a clear picture of how he sees things as opposed to how a quote unquote normal person would see things. I feel that it also does what a lot of books tend to veer away from, um, and or TV or film adaptations, and that is really focusing on the romantic and glorifying the romantic and uh, caring aspects of this character of Joe, and it focuses more on the big picture of his thought process and how his thought process drives him to rationalize different actions and different events within the course of the story itself. So we start out the story as it starts out in the Netflix series in the bookstore where Joe works in New York City, Mooney's books, his books, and Joe in this version, in the book version, is really a lot more Um, I want to say he's more the average guy. Um, he's more of the uh, average guy in the sense that his focus is really getting the girl and uh, feeling that in some ways he's justified in over sexualizing uh, the girl's actions and reactions and um, the way that she moves, talks, etc. And the girl, of course, is Beck. Um, and Beck is not much different from the character in the series, but she is different in the sense that she's a lot more naive in this book. Um, and a lot more grounded in that aspect as well. I feel that her character is well written, uh, and I mean that with all due sincerity because it is from Joe's perspective. So we have to keep that in mind when reading this book, that all the descriptions we get of Beck and the way that she acts and the way that she does things, it's all from Joe's point of view. So and it never deviates from that, which is really remarkable. But I digress. Basically, they meet, and it plays out the same as the TV show does, the Netflix show, I should say. Um, he uh, has his initial contact with her, and becomes somewhat initially obsessed, and starts to look her up online and basically find out what she's doing and where she lives, etc. And in the book version, she has Hannah and Lynn are her two best friends, so to speak, and of course Peach as well, Peach Salinger, and Peach, however, does not get along with Hannah and Lynn in the book. So Peach sort of isolates herself from the friend group, and we don't really meet Peach and have interaction with her until um, a little ways in. But Joe goes to see Beck do this poetry um, recital and basically reading one of her short stories. And the friends are, kind of being very catty about it. And uh, Beck is upset because the one gentleman that she has a sort of pseudo relationship with, Benji, did not show up. So she's upset about that, and she leaves shortly after giving her story, and she goes to the subway station along with Joe, who follows at a distance, and Joe watches her as she's texting, standing dangerously close to the actual edge of the subway, uh, the pickup drop off point, which is not recommended. Um, but she's intoxicated and she is definitely not in her right mind, and she's also texting Benji obsessively because Benji is not responding. and or if he is, it's basically just um, it's really not something that is heavily emphasized, but it's neither here nor there. Uh, in doing this texting, she is distracted by a bum who is singing in the subway station, and she ends up falling into the subway rail area. So Joe goes over and reaches down to save her and pulls her up. Um, and in doing so, he pockets her cell phone as she's quite shaken by what happened. And um, she takes the cab with him back to her apartment, and uh, she's basically saying that she'd like to give him her number, but she realizes she didn't have her phone, and Benji comes up and knocks on the window, and Benji sort of takes over the night from there. But Joe has her phone now, and um, that's sort of where the obsessive behavior amplifies because he's now able to not only watch her from a distance and look at her online, but he's also able to monitor her everyday schedule and her events once her mother replaces um, the phone, which is done rather rapidly. That's another thing that's different between the book and the series. Is the family dynamic between Beck and her dad, her stepmother and kids, and her actual mother. That's not really a deal breaker in terms of the differences, but I do feel it does make a difference to Beck's character in terms of how she perceives herself in terms of the story itself. Um, but basically, throughout the course of the book, you see this romance develop between Joe and Beck. Um, Joe does end up kidnapping Benji um, in the same way he does so in the show by faking that he is from a company that wants to sponsor Benji's um, homemade brand of seltzer. Um, and he, just like in the show, has this glass uh, box, basically, an unbreakable box that he puts Benji in, and it's just store rare books in, but he has Benji in there, and he basically uh, does a test with Benji, asking Benji what books he's read and to give him a report on these books. Turns out Benji had not read any of the books that Joe had asked about. I think with the exception one, but at the time when this was being done, I think Doctor Sleep by Stephen King was being released because that was being the book put was being pushed in the bookstore. So um, Joe brings a copy of that down for Benji to read, and he actually does read it. And uh, Joe's getting frustrated by Beck sort of obsessing over the loss of Benji and why he's missing. Um, but at the same time, she's moving on to Joe. So there is progress in her and Joe's relationship, quote unquote. Now, this sort of goes into this uh, party that Peach has with a lot of really obnoxious sort of people. Um, and uh, it it's one of those parties that is very stereotypical among uh, the elite Ivory school, Ivory branch kind of individuals. Not to knock any of those individuals, because I went to school with some myself at Wilkes University as well as Scranton U. But I digress again. um, Joe, at one point, he checks out some books in Peach's library, which is rather extensive, but there's nothing really uh, sketchy about that at all. So once they leave the party, um, Joe is really bent on spending the night with Beck and having some sort of encounter with Beck, but he's also trying to make her want him. So he's drawing it out, and uh, around that same time, he ends up uh, back with Benji again, and he brings Benji a peanut laced um, drink, and Benji was actually allergic to peanuts. He was not lying. And so uh, he has a reaction and he dies. And Joe does not really uh, hesitate as far as disposing of the body. He burns the body and puts the ashes in uh, the box from an item that was purchased by him and Beck at IKEA. I believe the new bed that Joe ended up putting together. I think that was what they bought that time. And but he puts the ashes in the box, basically disposes of it very effectively and very uh, just not even a second thought, not even remorseful at all, just does it. And it's very just instinctual. This is what you do. And in the show, that's different. I will get to that, though, after I summarize the book um, a little more for you guys. So we move on to Beck sort of pulling away. Peach is drawing more of Beck's attention, and Peach doesn't really approve of Joe not being educated the way they are as far as college goes, despite the fact he's read more books than either of them probably did in their lifetime. And it's really just a matter of competition at that point between Joe and Peach. And Peach does end up winning out to some degree and whisking Beck off to this um, sort of girls' escape. And because the other girls really aren't fond of Peach, they do not come. So it's just Peach um, and Beck, and Joe makes his way up to this area in the snow, after being beat up by one of his former employees and some of his thugs. And uh, he has a fender bender. He goes off the road, and uh, he actually basically almost crawls to Peach's house area and makes his way into a garage nearby, and is woke up by a policeman. And the policeman basically uh, takes him in and has him at the hospital, gets him fixed up, puts him at a train station, but um, Joe gets a car and goes back to the area, finds someplace else to hide to watch Peach and Beck, and makes his way into uh, the house of Peach as well. And once in there, he listens in on conversations. He does make his way out, and when he's outside, he's watching Peach's advances towards Beck. So it's clear that Peach is more interested in Beck in a deeper, more intimate way. But Beck resists and pushes her away, and Peach goes for one of her runs that she was really known for. There was a run earlier where Joe did end up attacking her, as it was played out in the show, much in the same manner. He did fail in terms of doing away with Peach. However, in this case, he does effectively do away with Peach and has no qualms about filling her pockets with rocks and dumping her into the ocean. Uh, so there is no remorse at all on the part of Joe. He is out for himself and out for what he feels he deserves, which is Beck. And Beck assumes the Peach just took off like she usually does, and she leaves, not giving it a second thought. Um, Joe has moved on at that point to seeing someone else, Karen Minty, and Karen is a rather obnoxious individual to a different degree than Beck's friends. Karen Minty is more of the, let's just say, the everyday girl. Um, just I don't want to say superficial, but she's really not. She's really a girl that isn't hard to please. She's very simple in terms of her wants, her needs, and she's very uh, just happy with what she has. And in a lot of aspects, because of that, she's a lot more balanced, I think, than Beck is, as well as most of Beck's uh, circle. And Beck is still in contact with Hannah and Lynn, but not really as much. Now, Beck is also seeing a psychologist, Dr. Nikki, and Joe goes to see Dr. Nikki under an assumed name. Joe, in this case, in the book, makes up a relationship, makes up a different name for himself, rather. Um, but as he does in the show as well, but he doesn't make himself out to be gay like he does in the show. And he basically tells the story of Karen and Beck to Dr. Nicky. And Dr. Nicky makes this analogy of, when you have a mouse in your house and you need to get the mouse out and be happy with what you have. And this sort of prompts Joe to actually approach Karen and move on from Beck, but he can never really get Beck out of his mind. And there is a suspicion from Joe that Beck is secretly involved with Dr. Nikki. So he's still obsessing over that. He's still checking things. And he actually stalks Nikki at one point, and is getting ready to actually uh, bash him with like uh, baton, basically, I believe, um, if memory serves me correctly. But um, he is sidetracked because there are some people coming around, and different things are going on in the book itself. So he doesn't actually do anything to Nikki, and he's thinking about what he should have done, what he could have done, but he doesn't really pursue it. And um, in checking Beck's emails and such, he's realizing that she's not. Um, Basically, it looks as though, from a distance, as Joe watches, that Beck is sending an email from him watching her outside of her apartment, and he's checking on her phone, and there's no indicator of that. So it's kind of questionable. And then um, Beck starts to pull away a little more once again, and Joe starts questioning it. And he meets another girl named Amy Adams. I'll get into that momentarily as well. But Amy Adams just comes into the store and has a little interaction. Joe's flirts back, but he eventually just focuses on Beck, and Beck is kind of moved in, kind of not, and really just kind of sharing different things with Joe, making their own little routines, and things seem to be going well for Joe and Beck at one point, and Joe is sort of checking up on her less, and then Joe comes home, and he had earlier in the story gotten really frustrated and angry and put a hole in his wall. And in that hole, he stored uh, pieces of Beck, basically. Um, Different panties, tampons, anything that would remind him of her was in this hiding space, in this box. And similar to the show, but not quite as um, uh, not quite as extravagant as it was in the show. But uh, he comes home after ordering her all these gifts online, and finds her there with the box and going ballistic on him, and it is a really intense interaction, and it ends up with uh, Beck basically being put into the glass cage in the basement of Mooney's bookstore, and by that point, Joe hired a new employee to take the place of his crappy one from earlier. So he has uh, Ethan working with him, and Ethan by that point is seeing Blythe, who is working with Beck on some publication work, and so everything's kind of interwoven. But Joe has Beck sequestered in this cage, and um, he uh, goes and um, eventually he finds um, uh, in Beck's apartment gin, which neither of them drink, and under her covers in the bed that he made, that he put together actually from IKEA. Um, he finds a MacBook, I think MacBook Plus, I think was it was a really trendy item, and Joe discovers that she had an alternate email address. She had uh, like over 400 email exchanges with Dr. Nikki that were ongoing, and that he was going to leave his wife for Beck, and he told his wife about Beck, and then Beck backed off and said she wasn't sure if she was ready to be a mother to his children, and Nikki was getting irritated by that, and uh, things weren't looking good for Beck. Joe brings this information back to Beck. He has a legal pad on hand with questions and basically what he deems are the right answers in terms of true and false questions. And he asks her a series of questions. And she very much uh, is obstinate at first. She does break down eventually. And she does try to get out by seducing Joe. She knows how he works. She knows how to make him tick, basically, and how he functions. So she plays on his desires, and she does. She tries to escape, and it doesn't really work out to her advantage. And while in the bookstore itself, in the middle of the night, roughly 4 a.m. or so, she is killed upstairs in the bookstore itself by Joe um, when she is fighting back and resisting and trying to escape. And Joe uh, takes her body, and yes, he is remorseful to a degree, but it's more so him lamenting what was the possibilities of him and Beck in terms of a relationship, not lamenting the death of Beck per se, more so what they could have had together and what he could have had as a result of having her in his life. And it's really a great depiction of psychopathic behavior and really just um, narcissism to its fullest extent. It's really interesting the way it's done, and it really goes to another extent when Joe goes to bury the body and takes it up to Dr. Nikki's area and buries it uh, about a quarter mile away from a wedding that is taking place between two individuals who are kind of inconsequential, Chet and Rose. Um, but the reason I mention their names is because after Joe buries Beck and leaves this area, he becomes obsessed with Chet and Rose and checks on their status as a married couple. And then suddenly, out of the blue, he gets an invitation to Ethan and Blythe's wedding, which is in Texas. They moved out of the area, and he is looking over the uh, food options and sort of thinking, fish or whatever, and that Amy Adams comes back in and asks him if he's hiring, and he does end up hiring her, and basically he says to himself, because it has Joe +1 on the invitation, he says to himself at the very end of the book, Amy Adams will be my +1. And that is how the book ends. And so he's basically replaced Beck with Amy, in other words, in the book. In the show, there are a lot of attempts to make Joe more uh, likable, I think, more rationalized, more reasonable, to show that he does have a heart, when people that are of that mindset really don't, when they are that far gone. And Joe happens to be one of those people who is that far gone. In the show, Peach is not as opposed to uh, Beck's other friends, um, not as much at least, but she still likes her one-on-one time with Beck, and she, as she does in the book as well, she continually calls Joe Joseph, and uh, in the show there are a lot of deviations as far as what events transpire and how they transpire. Um, but I think the most notable deviations in the show are the additions of characters to make Joe, I think, more of a grounded and likable character, like I said. There is a boy living in his apartment named Paco, and Joe basically gives the kid books, um, tries to help him out in terms of getting away from his mother and the mother's abusive boyfriend, and it's it's a subplot within the show, and it works within the show, but it sort of makes you wondering at the end, like how much you should really care about Joe. And in the book, because you're inside Joe's head the entire time, and you're seeing things from his point of view, you know that Joe is not all there. Joe is unstable. Joe is unsafe. But in the show, you don't get that feeling quite as much. You get the feeling. You do get the feeling. But there are these moments where you might think to yourself, he's not that bad of a guy. He did this, this, and this. But, so the show tries to counterbalance good events with bad events to a certain degree. And I think that, um, although yes, it does work in terms of the dramatization factor and the way things unfold in the TV show, Netflix original, sorry. It's hard to get used to saying online show, but there's less of a uh, there's less of a harshness to Joe in the show. When Joe kills Benji, in the show. He is honestly panicked as far as how he's going to deal with it. Um, Same thing when it comes to both assaults on Peach, the initial assault in her running, and afterwards when he actually kills Peach, which is in a different manner as well. Um, but it's things that Joe reflects on sort of more so than in the book. And also, there's no real confrontation as far as Dr. Nikki goes with um, Beck in the show. Because by that point, Dr. Nikki become irrelevant to uh, Beck, and it was more of um, her finding the box of keepsakes in Joe's apartment as opposed to uh, anything else really. Um, and in the book, I think it's also very sweet. There is a moment where Joe and Beck are interacting in the book, rather, and they are reading the Da Vinci Code because there are these subtle or not so subtle, Dan Brown um, references, and in particular to the Da Vinci Code, and uh, because it's not a book that either of them have read, Joe brings the book down to Beck in the book and um, has her gives her a copy and he has a copy and they read it together. And you think to yourself, well, this is actually kind of sweet. And it's around the time when Joe kills Beck that he realizes in the book that there are certain pages that were never turned because he works in a bookstore. He knows when books have been read and when they have not been touched as frequently, or even at all for that matter. So he knows that she skipped around and she was not sincere in her feelings for him. And that gives him a lot of anger and frustration in the book itself. In the show, there's a Dan Brown reference like once or twice, but it's not relevant to the plot line as much as it is in the book itself. So that's another change I feel that is really significant because although it's kind of a little plot point, it does bring them together in Joe's mind briefly toward the end of the book. Whereas in the show, it doesn't even become a plot point at the end. He has her in a cage. She tries to play on him, tries to escape, um, and in doing so, she ends up dead. Um, we don't know anything about where things were really in the show, but there are uh, indicators where Joe has basically implicated Dr. Nikki in the final doing away with Beck. And it's all basically outlined in letters and different things that Joe has set up to basically set Dr. Nikki up. Um, and uh, yeah, the show ends with the person walking into the shop being Joe's ex, Candace, who is alluded to in the book one of you as his ex, and he goes into somewhat graphic detail as to how he did away with Candace, in addition to Candace's brother. But that's not something, even in the show, when you get that to that point in season two, there's a flashback from Candace's perspective, and uh, it's really, it shows how Joe's rationalizing things again, and it doesn't paint Candace in a particularly good light. Um, it's hard to say how Candace was because all we have in the first book of You is Joe's perspective on Candace. So there are, like I said, a lot of differences between the book and the show. I personally think the book would have been better adapted had it been just fully adapted as is. But I do enjoy the show as well as its separate entity and its separate universe. And I do feel that it does a good job in uh, depicting irrational and obsessive behavior. At the same time, though, as I said, the show rationalizes Joe's behavior. The show justifies uh, Joe's behavior to an extent, more so than the book does. The book makes no attempts at hiding the fact that Joe is not stable, that Joe is definitely unstable, and definitely obsessive and um, uh, not someone who really has morals. And the show gives Joe morals, whereas the book does not. The book basically shows a gentleman who is without morals, he's out for himself, and he rationalizes him being out for himself by projecting his wants and desires onto others and what's best for them. And I think it's really interesting to compare and contrast. So there you have you a review of the book, which I highly recommend, and the series, which I highly recommend, season one. I will be doing a review of season two as well. And in addition to you, book two, once I am able to obtain it, I did listen to it on Audible. I have an Audible account, which I uh, get all of my audiobooks on, and it was a lot more cost effective than trying to purchase audiobooks outright, despite my love of physical media and having books on my shelves. Um, they are quite costly in terms of the CDs, so I have turned to Audible for audiobooks, and this is available on audio on Audible, and it is read phenomenally, really, really great narration, and I highly recommend listening to it or reading it as soon as possible. Once again, this is Rob with Media Awareness. I hope you enjoyed this book review slash compare and contrast between You, the book, the novel, book one, and the Netflix original series, which I sort of skimmed through. But when comparing and contrasting, I didn't want to spend too much time on either or. I just wanted to give you more of the book and how good the book is. Because the book is just amazing. And it draws you in, and it really, really is riveting. Uh, the show does the same thing, but from a different angle. And like I said, the show fails in showing just how despicable of a human being Joe actually is. Um, but it succeeds in other areas as well. So both are very good, and I recommend both. But read the book first. Do yourself a favor and do that. And please remember the fundraiser continues. Any and all support is welcome. You can contribute at the spot fund link below, and as stated previously, you can even contribute anonymously. Please subscribe to my channel and become part of the Media Awareness family. Ring the bell icon to be notified whenever I upload something new. And I will see you all again soon. Have a wonderful morning, noon, or night wherever you are. Take care. Bye.